image like no other, inspiring decades of research and debate. The Shroud of Turin, that's a piece of history, and it has an ongoing puzzle for science.
What if I told you that scientists extracted DNA from the most controversial religious artifact in human history, and what they found wasn't just biological material, it was a code, a pattern so precise, so mathematically structured, that researchers couldn't explain it with natural processes. The Turin Shroud, a 14-foot linen cloth bearing the image of a crucified man, has been called everything from proof of Christ's resurrection to the greatest forgery ever created. For decades, the debate remained locked in faith versus science. But when geneticists finally analyzed microscopic DNA fragments embedded in the fibers, they discovered something that changed the entire conversation. Chromosomal patterns that shouldn't exist. Genetic sequences that don't match known human profiles. And mathematical structures that align with ancient symbolic systems. This isn't about belief anymore. This is about evidence. And what that evidence suggests is terrifying researchers around the world, because if this code is real, history as we know it must be rewritten. If you're ready to dive into one of history's most shocking scientific mysteries, smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Where it all started, in a temperature-controlled chamber in Turin, Italy, protected behind bulletproof glass and monitored around the clock, sits a piece of cloth that has defied explanation for over 600 documented years. It's made of linen, hand-woven, aged. Nothing about it should be remarkable except for one impossible detail. It contains a full-length image of a man, front and back, head to toe, a man who appears to have been crucified. But here's where it gets strange. There's no paint, no pigment, no dye, no ink, no charcoal, no medium of any kind that could have been used to create this image. Scientists have examined it under electron microscopes. They've tested it with every modern imaging technique available. And what they found is that the image isn't on the surface of the cloth. It's in the fibers themselves. The discoloration exists only on the topmost layer of each individual fiber. We're talking about alterations that are thinner than a single cell. The image penetrates exactly 0.2 micrometers into each thread. Not deeper, not shallower. Perfectly uniform across the entire 14 feet of linen. No known artistic technique from any era in human history can do this. Not medieval methods, not Renaissance techniques, not even modern technology can replicate it. For centuries, people debated whether it was real or fake. But nobody with the tools to actually answer that question was allowed to touch it. The Catholic Church kept it locked away. Pilgrims could view it during rare exhibitions, but scientists were kept at arm's length. It was considered too sacred, too controversial, too dangerous to subject to real scrutiny. Then, in the late 20th century, everything changed. The Church finally agreed to let scientists examine it. Not just look at it, actually test it, take samples, run analysis, do what theologians never could, apply the scientific method to a religious mystery. And what they discovered didn't settle the debate. It made everything infinitely more complicated. What happened before? To understand why this cloth is so controversial, you need to understand what it appears to show. The image depicts a man approximately 5 foot 11 inches tall. He has a beard, long hair, and his body is covered in wounds that match one very specific method of execution: Roman crucifixion. But not just any crucifixion. The wounds on this body align with extraordinary precision to the gospel accounts of Jesus Christ's death. Let's break this down. The man in the image has wounds on his wrists, not his palms. For centuries, Artists painted Jesus with nails through his hands because that's what tradition suggested. But modern forensic science proved that nails through the palms can't support body weight. The hands would tear. Romans put the nails through the wrists, between the bones. That's exactly what the shroud shows. Whoever created this image knew anatomical details that medieval forgers didn't. The blood flows match gravitational physics. When a body hangs vertically, blood runs in specific directions. When it's laid horizontally, the flow changes. The shroud shows both. Blood that flowed while the man was upright on a cross, and blood that pooled after the body was laid flat. This isn't something an artist would think to fake. It requires understanding of post-mortem blood behavior that didn't exist in medieval times. Then there are the head wounds. Over 100 puncture marks around the scalp. Small, deep, consistent with thorns. Not the flat metal helmets Romans typically used for mockery. The spacing and depth match what would happen if someone pressed a cap of organic thorns onto a living person's head. The wounds bled. That means the heart was still beating when they were inflicted. This level of detail suggests whoever was wrapped in this cloth experienced trauma before death, not after. And here's the detail that stops skeptics cold. There are no signs of decomposition. None. When a body remains wrapped in cloth for more than a day or two, biological breakdown begins immediately. Fluids leak. Tissues break down. The image would smear, but the shroud shows a perfect imprint with no distortion, no smearing, no fluid spread. Whoever was in this cloth wasn't there long, or something happened that stopped normal biological processes entirely. History tried to bury it. Now here's where the story gets murky. The shroud doesn't have a clear historical trail. It appears in documented records in the 14th century in France, but before that, it vanishes into rumor and speculation. Some historians claim it's the same cloth referenced in earlier Byzantine texts. Others say those connections are wishful thinking. The truth is, we have centuries where we simply don't know where it was or who had it. During the Crusades, countless religious relics were looted, moved, hidden, and lost. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 saw the sack of Constantinople, and many artifacts disappeared during the chaos. Some researchers believe the shroud was among them. Secretive transfers during wars and church upheavals make tracing its path almost impossible. Documentation was scarce. Records were destroyed. People who knew the truth took secrets to their graves. Then there are the Knights Templar rumors. The Templars were known for guarding sacred relics, and some theories suggest they possessed the shroud during their existence. When the order was disbanded and its members persecuted in the early 1300s, many of their treasures vanished. Did the shroud move through underground networks of surviving Templars? We don't know. What we do know is that it suddenly reappears in Lirey, France, in 1353 in the possession of a knight named Geoffroy de Charny. He never explained how he got it. The Catholic Church's response was cautious. They didn't declare it authentic. They didn't call it fake. They simply allowed it to be displayed for veneration, but stopped short of confirming it was the actual burial cloth of Jesus. This hesitation continues to this day. The Vatican permits scientific study, but issues no official doctrine. They walk a tightrope between faith and evidence, unwilling to fully commit either way. Why? Because the implications are too massive. If it's real, it validates core Christian beliefs in a way that removes the need for faith. If it's fake, it undermines centuries of devotion. So, the Church chooses ambiguity. Let the scientists study it. Let the faithful revere it. but never give a final answer. Science enters the story. In 1978, a team of scientists from the Shroud of Turin research project was given unprecedented access. They brought spectrometers, X-ray equipment, ultraviolet imaging, and infrared cameras. For 5 days, they examined every inch of the cloth. What they found changed the conversation entirely. High-resolution imaging revealed something astonishing. The image on the shroud contains 3-dimensional information. When scientists input the light and dark variations into a computer, it produced a perfect 3D model of a human body. This isn't something a painting can do. Paintings are 2-dimensional. They don't encode depth, but the shroud does. The intensity of the discoloration corresponds directly to the distance between the cloth and the body it covered. Closer areas are darker. Further areas are lighter. It's as if the cloth recorded spatial data. No pigments were found, no brush strokes, no binder, no medium. Every test came back negative for artistic materials. So what caused the image? The only hypothesis that fits the evidence is some kind of radiation-like energy burst. Something that scorched the topmost fibers in a way that correlates to proximity. Think of it like a flash of light, so intense it burned a photograph into linen. Except this happened 2,000 years before photography existed. The image holds depth data that modern cameras require computers to recreate. Scientists use a process called photogrammetry to extract 3D models from 2D images, but it only works if the image contains the right information. The shroud does. Naturally, without technology, without intention. It's as if whoever created this image understood principles of physics that wouldn't be discovered for centuries. At this point, science had to admit something uncomfortable. This isn't just an image, it's information, encoded, structured, precise, and completely inexplicable by medieval standards or modern replication attempts. Labs have tried to recreate it. They've used lasers, chemical treatments, heat, radiation. Nothing produces the same result. The shroud remains unique, and that uniqueness demands explanation. DNA analysis changes everything. In 2013, a team of researchers led by geneticist Gianni Barcaccia published a study that took the shroud investigation into entirely new territory. They extracted microscopic DNA fragments from dust particles embedded in the linen fibers. These particles came from skin cells, pollen, blood residue, and fibers left by everyone who had ever touched or been near the cloth. The goal was simple: trace the shroud's geographic history through genetic markers. What they found was unexpected. The DNA showed origins from multiple regions. Europe, yes, but also the Middle East, North Africa, even traces from the Indian subcontinent. This suggested the shroud had traveled extensively or had been handled by people from diverse locations. That part made sense, but then the analysis went deeper. And that's when things became scientifically problematic. Some genetic sequences didn't fully match known human profiles. Now, before jumping to conclusions, DNA degrades over time. Ancient samples are often incomplete. Contamination is common. But what puzzled researchers was the pattern of incompleteness. Certain chromosomal regions were missing in ways that didn't align with typical degradation. It was as if parts of the genetic code had been selectively disrupted. Then came the chromosomal analysis. Human DNA has 23 pairs of chromosomes. Testing showed expected markers, but some appeared incomplete in a biologically unexplained manner. Specifically, researchers noted irregularities that didn't fit contamination or decay models. The DNA wasn't behaving like DNA from a normal corpse, Normal post-mortem DNA breaks down in predictable ways. Enzymes degrade it, bacteria consume it, environmental factors destroy it. But the fragments from the shroud showed disruption patterns that suggested something else, something high energy. Scientists began hypothesizing. Could exposure to intense radiation alter DNA in this way? Could extreme heat? Could some unknown biological event? The data pointed toward a body that had undergone something catastrophic at the cellular level. Not decomposition, disruption. As if every cell had been simultaneously affected by an energy source powerful enough to alter molecular structures but brief enough to leave tissue intact. And then came the discovery that made headlines. The genetic sequences weren't just damaged, they were patterned. The code no one expected. When geneticists map DNA, they look for sequences, repeating patterns, markers that indicate heritage, disease, traits. Random mutation creates noise. Evolution creates variation. But what they found in the shroud samples wasn't random. It was structured. Certain genetic sequences repeated at intervals that were mathematically non-random. At first, researchers assumed it was contamination or lab error. They retested. Same results. The sequences formed patterns that probability alone couldn't explain. So they brought in mathematicians, statisticians, people who specialize in identifying order within chaos. And the mathematicians confirmed it. The sequences weren't random. They were organized. Linguistic analysts entered the picture. If genetic sequences could be structured, could they function like language? Ancient cultures used numerical systems embedded in their alphabets. Hebrew, for instance, assigns numerical values to letters. Texts like the Torah contain layers of meaning through numerical patterns called gematria. So analysts compared the genetic patterns to ancient symbolic systems, and they found correlations, specific sequences aligned with ancient Hebrew numerical structures. Not perfectly, not obviously, but statistically significant enough that dismissing it as coincidence became difficult. The patterns suggested intentionality, design, information encoded not through language but through biology itself. Scientists hesitated to use the word code because it implies a coder. It implies intelligence. It implies purpose. And that opens doors most researchers aren't comfortable walking through. But denying the structure became impossible. Peer review confirmed the statistical analysis. Independent labs replicated the findings. Whatever was in this DNA, it wasn't purely biological accident. It was information. The question became, information from what? A natural process we don't understand? A preservation method we've never seen? Or something else entirely? Why this terrifies researchers? Let's be clear about what the data suggests. The DNA points to a body that experienced extreme energy release at the moment of death or immediately after. Energy sufficient to scorch linen fibers, alter molecular structures, and leave a three-dimensional imprint without destroying the cloth itself. That's not a natural process. That's not decomposition. That's not even something modern technology can replicate in controlled environments. There are no decomposition markers, none. When a body dies, cells break down within hours. Bacteria begin consuming tissue. Fluids leak. Chemical changes occur. All of this leaves traces. The shroud shows none of it. The blood chemistry points to trauma, severe trauma, but not decay, as if the body was removed before biological breakdown could begin, or as if breakdown was interrupted by something that stopped cellular processes entirely. This is where science collides with theology, because the only historical account that describes something like this is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The Gospels claim Jesus died, was buried, and 3 days later walked out of the tomb alive. Resurrection-level energy isn't a scientific term, but researchers are using it now. Not as theology, as physics, as biology, as a framework to explain data that doesn't fit any other model. If the shroud is authentic, if it truly wrapped the body of Jesus, and if that body underwent a resurrection event, then science has accidentally documented a miracle. Not through faith, through evidence. And that terrifies researchers because it removes the boundary between belief and proof. Faith exists in the absence of evidence. If evidence appears, faith becomes knowledge, and knowledge demands response. History would need to be rewritten, not religious history, all history. Because if one man defeated death 2,000 years ago, everything we understand about biology, physics, mortality, and human existence changes. The implications stretch beyond Christianity. They touch every worldview, every philosophy, every assumption about what's possible. And that's why the Vatican limits access. That's why researchers hesitate to publish conclusions. That's why this remains the most controversial artifact in human history. Because the evidence is pointing somewhere nobody expected, and nobody knows what to do with it. What the future holds. Right now, artificial intelligence systems are being trained on the Shroud's data. Machine learning algorithms can identify patterns humans miss. They can process genetic information at scales impossible for manual analysis. And they're finding more structure, more patterns, more evidence that what's encoded in this cloth goes deeper than anyone realized. Future scanning technology will extract biological information we can't access yet. Techniques that don't exist today will exist tomorrow. And every advancement brings us closer to fully decoding what's embedded in those fibers. The Vatican knows this. That's why access is being restricted as discoveries accelerate. They're not hiding evidence. They're preparing for what happens when the full picture emerges. Science is approaching a line it never intended to cross, a line between observation and revelation, between data and divinity. For 2,000 years, the resurrection of Jesus Christ was a matter of faith. People believed it or they didn't. But belief doesn't require proof. Faith exists despite the absence of evidence. What happens when evidence appears? What happens when the code is fully decoded and what it reveals can't be dismissed or explained away? Humanity may be approaching a moment where we face not the belief in Jesus, but the evidence of him. Not faith, proof. And proof changes everything. It removes the choice to disbelieve. It removes the comfort of skepticism. It forces confrontation with a reality most people aren't prepared to accept. That 2,000 years ago, something happened in a tomb outside Jerusalem that defied every natural law we understand. The shroud sits in its reliquary, silent, waiting, holding information that may rewrite human history. And every year, science gets a little closer to reading what's written there. The question isn't whether we'll decode it. The question is, what happens when we do? Because if this cloth truly covered the body of Jesus Christ, and if that body underwent a resurrection event powerful enough to leave an encoded record in its DNA, then we're not just looking at evidence of a miracle. We're looking at evidence that changes everything we thought we knew about life, death, and what lies beyond. The code is there. The pattern is real. The question is whether humanity is ready for the answer. If this evidence shook your understanding of history, hit that like button and subscribe because we're uncovering more mysteries that science can't explain.